Hey, folks, this is your buddy Mike Messier. We're just about to go live here. At any given point, I will just keep babbling a little bit until I make sure that we're actually locked and loaded and we're live. With the modern technology, you just want to make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind. And, okay. Hey, folks, this is your buddy Mike Messier. I'm here with my good friend Jimmy Faluca. Jimmy, you are in Staten Island, is that correct?
That is correct. Thunderstorms and all.
I appreciate the fact that you're here with me tonight, buddy. And Jimmy is actually a family man. He's got two great kids and a happy wife, and so I appreciate you going through the extra effort of going outside to allow your family to sleep in silence while we talk about summertime wrestling memories.
Yeah, got to get permission from the wife first. Anyone who's about to get married always asks permission first.
How long have you guys been married, Jimmy? Just so
We have been married since 2017. We have been together since 2011. So it's quite a bit of time.
That's fantastic. The last time I talked to you, I think we had a little run-in from your sister. I think if that's
she was coming by the apartment and she kind of poked her head in. She's a big wrestling fan herself, so when she knows I'm on a show talking wrestling, she wants to listen in.
Well, she's welcome to come back anytime, buddy. So,
Thank you.
Jimmy, growing up in the Northeast, that's definitely a hotbed for what used to be the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, then the World Wrestling Federation, then the WWE starting in 2002.
Mhm.
I grew up in a kind of a battleground state. I grew up in Northern Virginia.
Okay.
We were a WWF territory for a long time, and then actually was, believe it or not, Georgia Championship Wrestling invaded the Baltimore arena for I think 3 or 4 shows. I didn't get to go to any of those. I was a little too young for that, but I did start going to the Baltimore arena. The first show I saw there, buddy, there was only 6 matches on the card, and the card was 4.5 hours. The first match was Brad Armstrong versus Pistol Pez Watley for a 20-minute draw, or Shaska Watley at the time. And then the main event was Nikita Koloff versus Ric Flair for 56 minutes.
Wow.
And after 56 minutes, Flair backdrop Nikita over the top rope and gets disqualified. So today's wrestling fan would be hashtagging that into oblivion. But at the time, I hadn't seen anything like that. I was used to the Hulk Hogan, finger of doom, leg drop combo.
Yeah. Back then in those territories, you hit a guy with a roll of quarters, you run that angle for 6 months. Ain't like that no more.
Yeah. I mean, it's you can call it evolution or progress or devolution, but I wanted to keep this because you and I are both fairly critical guys as far as the modern product. Just before we went on the air, you were kind of putting over what LA Knight's doing over in WWE. You were saying that Adam Cole and MJF have great chemistry in their world title feud. So I give you credit that you're finding stuff, that's still good in wrestling. There's always going to be something that's good.
No, of course. That goes without saying. See, my philosophy has always been this. When there is credit to be given, give it. When there's criticism to be given, give it. And I feel like that's a fair way to go about things. See, like I was mentioning to you before, I did not expect the chemistry between Adam Cole and MJF to work so well, but it is. And I'm happy to be wrong about that. It's no different than LA Knight. I did not think this guy was going to catch fire, but my ears work perfectly. And I hear the reactions he's getting because I watch the clips on YouTube because I have been working 3 to 11. So I don't get to see these things happen live.
Right.
But when I go on YouTube or I get a message from my friends like, Jim, you got to hear this reaction this guy got, or you have to see how this went. I will check it out. No problem. I didn't think that was going to happen for either of them. And it is. It's great. But I will also be the first to mention when I see things like, okay, AEW had something with Wardlow. He had a lot of momentum, and now it kind of feels like he's cooled off.
Oh, yeah.
WWE had a lot of momentum with Sami Zayn. It is clearly cooled off. And I am just not a fan of when someone has momentum just putting it aside, because as a longtime wrestling fan, what's the hardest thing to do in wrestling? Get
Is
over.
to get is to get momentum in the first place.
So when you do, you gotta strike while the iron's hot. Otherwise, you may not get that chance again. And especially with Sami Zayn, with the whole bloodline thing. Listen, I understand. I'm in the minority. A lot of people really like the bloodline. They like what Roman Reigns is doing, and that's fine. More power to him. However, it has to be mentioned, though, in WWE, they're really not giving you any other stories like to that degree. I firmly believe they go into these creative meetings. What are we doing for the bloodline? Let's call it a day, because it's rematch after rematch with the rest of the card. There's not a lot of real solid storytelling going on with the rest. Now you kind of got something going on with the Judgment Day, because now Finn Balor's going for the world heavyweight belt and Damian Priest has the briefcase, so there's tension.
Right.
I'll grant you that. But Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens are the tag team champions, and their fate now is what I feared it would be going into Mania, that once they won the tag belts from the Usos, who do they really have to feud with? Because as we both know, Vince Jr. is not a fan of tag team wrestling. He has never been. You had that one period in the 80s where you had a lot of tag teams, which was great. And then in the late 90s, when he was trying, because he was getting beat, and Vince never gets beat, you had the Hardys, the Dudleys, Edge and Christian. They were given their shot. But in more recent years, the tag team division really hasn't been given a lot of shine. Up until the Usos got it, the belts were passed around like hand-me-downs. And I knew that once Sami and Kevin got it off them and they were done feuding with the Usos, they weren't going to have any more meat on the bone to chew on, because the tag team division's been obliterated.
It kind of feels like a consolation prize.
Exactly.
Sami, and the irony, Jimmy, is, and we're going to get into our summertime wrestling memories in a moment, but just to finish up on this, it's like, we thought, the prevailing internet wrestling community, whatever you want to call it, thought that, okay, they're pushing Sami to the side because they want to put that title on Cody at Mania.
That ain't happening.
And as I predicted in my prediction video, Roman retained the title more or less clean, and Cody's nowhere near that belt, and neither is Sami. And to be honest with you, Jimmy, I'm going to do a video. I'm more or less predicting that Roman's going to beat Bruno's record. I feel that they trust.
That won't surprise me. He's been there. Yeah. He's been their pet project since the Shield. He's been, right. And that to me will always taint him, to me, because I am more of the belief you should get that spot because you got over and you earned it, like a Steve Austin did, like Hogan did in the AWA. Like most believe that Hogan became what he did because Vince Jr. strapped the rocket to him. No, he got over because he got over in the AWA, which is where Hulkamania was born. Steve Austin got over because the crowd took to him. They tried to push Rocky when he was young, but it wasn't working. They listened to the crowd. He turned into The Rock, and then he got over the right way. I mean, these are the past is a roadmap on where you should go, especially in wrestling. But unfortunately, it seems that more fans these days want to bury the past. And I feel like that's a disservice to the guys that broke their bodies for the business.
Yeah, Jimmy, I always said that when I was a kid, I would read the wrestling magazines that it was Sports Review Wrestling that had this section called Remember When, or it was kind of like the time capsule, something like that. And they would have every month what happened 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier, and 15 years earlier.
Wow. That's
so
nice.
It was pretty nice because I was kind of learning on and for whatever, that was an aftermag, Sports Review Wrestling, that people kind of forget about that one. But for me, that had some columns in it that were kind of unique as far as the, I think it was called the JC London publishing company, which was the aftermags. But let's segue into our trip down. Yes, the summertime wrestling memories. Before we went on the air, Jimmy, I don't know if you can see it. I might have to take my background filter off, but I did make some notes for this thing of just what came to the top of my head. But I'm going to give you the floor first. When you think of, and this is just open-ended, if it could be stuff you watched on TV, it could be stuff you went to the arena and saw live, but just talking about the general, months of June, July, August, maybe the first couple of days of September. What do you think of, Jimmy, from your own personal slant as far as pro wrestling memories from the summertime.
Well, I started watching wrestling week to week when I was about 6 years old. My first my first real exposure to full-time wrestling was the summer of 1996. I mean, as a kid, like 3, 4, 5 years old, I knew who the Macho Man was. I knew who Hulk Hogan was. I knew who The Undertaker was because when I was 3, my dad took me to MSG and The Undertaker actually shook my hand. He shook a couple
Wow.
of kids' hands, and I got a Polaroid picture of him coming out of the entranceway, the gray tie, the hat. Matter of fact, when I met him, I brought that picture with me to show him how long I've been a fan of his. And he looked at that picture for a good 2 minutes. He's like, "Wow, I can't believe you kept this all this time." Because that's always, but he was always my guy, and he still is.
Yeah.
But my first big memory from the summertime was Hogan joining the NWO. When I saw him drop the leg on Randy Savage, you have to understand, for me as a kid, I loved the Macho Man more than Hogan.
Right.
And anytime I saw them fight, Macho always lost. And that used to annoy me as a kid. Granted, as I got older, I understood why, because Hogan was the big star. Even though Savage in his own right was a big star. Hogan was just on a different stratosphere, and I accept that. But when Hogan dropped that leg on him, and then he pitched the referee out of the ring, which we came to find was a mistake by Hulk because the referee was supposed to count the 3. Scott Hall improvised the 3 count, which was supposed to be the referee.
Right.
But when I saw that, and the fans started throwing garbage in the ring, that was something. I was like this the whole time. I couldn't believe that Hulk Hogan had become a bad guy. I just never, even as a kid, I couldn't fathom that because he was always the good guy.
Right.
Another memory of mine, ironically, it's from a SummerSlam, was when Paul Bearer turned his back on The Undertaker.
Was that SummerSlam 96 against Mankind?
Yes, it was. And that matter of fact, that's one of my father's favorite matches because he was a big Cactus Jack fan. He followed him from WCW, ECW. My dad was a huge Cactus Jack fan.
Yeah.
So he loved Mankind, which, hey, listen, that's pretty good taste. So when I saw Paul turn his back to The Undertaker, and then he was laughing as The Undertaker was being destroyed with the mandible claw, it was something because that was a 6-year partnership. To me, they were like Batman and Robin.
Right.
Because as a kid, I was a big Batman fan. I watched
maybe Batman and Arthur.
Possibly.
Yeah, because more like the managerial guy instead of the sidekick. That's why I said Arthur, Batman.
Alfred, I guess.
Alfred, thank you. Yeah,
Alfred was the butler. So,
right.
So when I saw that, I couldn't believe it. That was huge for me because as a big Undertaker fan, and then seeing him get carried away by the Druids, that was the first time that had ever happened. Another summer memory of mine for wrestling.
Let me jump in on that one first, buddy. Was that the Boiler Room Brawl at SummerSlam 96?
In the Gund Arena. Yes, it was. And let me tell you something. The way that Mick Foley was so giving of himself physically.
Oh, yeah.
He went out of his way to ensure that not only did he look good, but he made sure his opponent looked like a monster. Like I recall, and this isn't a summer match, but I recall him having a match with Shawn Michaels at In Your House, and he made Shawn Michaels look like a tough SOB, and Shawn Michaels was still doing the sexy boy gimmick.
Right.
And he wasn't looked at as a tough guy. But in that match, Mick made him look good because Mick is he's a phenomenal, he gets the psychology of wrestling, which is what makes him exceptional. He's Jake Roberts in that aspect, where he knows where to go and how. But back to the Boiler Room Brawl, had they ever done anything like that before? Where the match is
I don't think so.
Oh.
Actually, they did. And I can tell you what it was. It wasn't that much earlier. It was at WrestleMania 12 that same year, 96, so just 3 or 4 months earlier.
Right. Piper and Goldust.
And if to give Piper and Goldust, and then Foley and Mankind, Foley and Undertaker credit, those were kind of the predecessors to what we now call the cinematic matches.
Exactly. And they really, I mean, they beat the tar out of each other in there because Taker's going to lay it in. Foley can take the punishment, but he can dish it out as well. And they really had, and to me, what is known as is an underrated rivalry, because to me, Mankind brought out the best in the Undertaker. I know everyone points to Shawn Michaels, the legendary Hell in a Cell match, the Mania match at 25, the retirement match. I get that, and as a match from bell to bell, they are phenomenal. But Mankind brought a different element to the Undertaker, and here's my example from King of the Ring that summer. The first time they had a pay-per-view match, that was the first time any of us, number one, saw the Undertaker appear on the top rope to attack Mankind because the rivalry had been so heated that quickly. And number two, look at how that match started. The Undertaker was wailing punch after punch after punch after punch at a fast rate. The Undertaker was usually slow and plodding. Here, there was none of that. He was going for the jugular immediately. And that let you know that the Undertaker took him seriously as a threat. And Mankind was the first person that I ever remember as a kid making me fear for the Undertaker's safety, especially in that Boiler Room Brawl. And I love recalling these things because, and I told Mick this to his face, when I was a kid, he made me afraid for the Undertaker, which means he did his job to perfection.
Right.
Another summer memory of mine, not a fond one, but as I grew up, I grew to appreciate it more, was when The Undertaker and Bret Hart had their match at
SummerSlam 97. Yep.
Kind of a bittersweet night because I was petrified for Steve Austin because he got dumped on his head.
Oh, yeah.
That was scary because I remember, I have to understand, when I was a kid, I watched all those pay-per-views with my dad. I was only 7 years old.
Right.
That was our thing. We watched wrestling together all the time. And when I saw Steve get dumped on his head and he didn't move, and Owen was just was going like that, I heard my father in the back saying, "He's hurt. He's hurt. This is no good," because he wasn't seeing Austin move. He saw the way that pile driver hit. It was tough to watch. Even as a kid, I was afraid, and as an adult, knowing, especially now that I'm trained in certain surgeries, knowing how bad Austin's neck was messed up, that man's lucky he was able to walk again.
Did you ever see the thing, Jimmy, where in Japan, Steve Austin actually, before that happened, like 3 or 4 years earlier, when Austin was in WCW, he was in a match in Japan, and Austin delivered a tombstone pile driver on a Japanese opponent, and almost to a T, he delivered it just like Owen delivered it to him 5 years later. And Austin, I think he might have given that guy a what they call it, a stinger, like a minor temporary paralysis. So if you look it up on,
I didn't know that.
I didn't know this until about 2 years ago. But if you look it up, it's on YouTube. It's like whoever it was. Yeah, I think it might have been part of that. Like the WCW was part. They did that NWA singles title tournament thing. It might have been part of that, or just some random, Steve Austin's in Japan. But he was still in
WCW had a relationship with Japan where they would intermingle from time to time.
Correct. And so he gave this tombstone pile driver. I can't remember who he did it to, but the guy did experience, very similar to what Austin himself would get years later. Also, I wouldn't want to forget, since we're talking mid to late 90s, was such a great time for wrestling. Mm-hmm. Steve Austin kind of kicked off that, King of the Ring has always been an interesting one for the WWF side of things, because it's kind of like the kickoff to summer. It's like what comes before SummerSlam once they put that into the rotation. And, Steve Austin winning that 96 King of the Ring really jump-started that summer. And things really were pretty awesome for WWF in 98, 99, 2000. But if you look back at the stuff they did in 96 and 97, I think that was even more interesting, because you had the backstage stuff with Michaels and Brett. You had Austin coming up you had this threat of WCW doing better in the ratings and so forth. So it seemed like it was really a turbulent time, and they were kind of shedding that skin of all the gimmicks, the Duke the Dumpster Drosy's and guys, who were kind of doing that type of, the professional wrestlers with other professions, like the Bob the Builder as a wrestler, or who was the plumber guy? They had the Dirty White Boy as a plumber, TL Hopper. Anyway, man, I want to go back even deeper into some of. Actually, I want to go to one of your wrestling memories. You talked about the NWO. I was actually at a pro wrestling show that night that the NWO was formed, with Hogan giving the big leg drop to Savage.
You
And
said that on your last show. You said that on your last show.
Yeah, I was actually at the Providence Civic Center watching a fairly mid, as MJF would say, card, main evented by Shawn Michaels and Big Van Vader, which I think they did the same thing they did at SummerSlam, like the DQ finish, count out finish, and then the final, the finish. Right. So I think they did that in Providence like 2 months before SummerSlam, and it was just when I've looked up the card in to see who was on it, and they had like Skip and Zip, and they had the Godwins, they had the Billy and Bart Gunn. I went to something before the show where the Guns were signing autographs, and I actually had weightlifting gloves signed by Billy and Bart Gunn that, I wish I still had those. But the point is, even sitting there in the Providence Civic Center, I was like, man, something big is going to happen tonight on that WCW pay-per-view, and we're missing it. Because I was with a couple of buddies, and we were wrestling fans. That's why we're here in Providence watching live wrestling. But we're kind of like, in our stomachs, we're like, man, we're missing something big.
Yeah, we should be at Dash at the Beach.
Yeah, right. Or at least I'd be at home watching it.
Oh, yeah.
My rule of thumb, Jimmy, is whenever there's an opportunity to do something in lifetime, even if it's not as important or not as big as the thing that's happening on TV, I tend to want to be there in person. You know what I mean?
No, I understand. One of my other summer memories is from a live event that I went to with my father, which was in '98. It was the Don't Trust Anybody tour. It was in MSG. I remember because my father used to work for the Department of Sanitation, and he used to help the handicapped kids go into MSG. And his boss said, listen, you're helping with this. If you want, bring your son and he could watch the wrestling with you. Well, not only did he bring me to the show to watch the wrestling, I was able to go backstage and meet a bunch of them. I got to meet Bradshaw. I got to meet Ken Shamrock. I got to meet Scotty 2 Hotty, who was playing a joke on me because he asked me who my favorite wrestler was. And I told him it was The Undertaker. And there was a closed door in front of us. He said, well, don't make too much noise because Kane's in that next room. And scared the shit out of 8-year-old Jimmy. I met Ron Simmons as Farouk, which was really, really cool. I met Mark Henry. I met the late Darren Draws, God rest his soul.
Oh, yes, a few weeks ago, yeah.
And I tell you, man, I'm proud to say this. I got to hang out with Owen Hart.
Wow.
And let me tell you something. One of the sweetest, not just saying it because of what happened to him, one of the sweetest guys that I ever met in wrestling. He was a gentleman. And I'm proud to say that when I met Brett, the day I met my wife, I met the Hitman. I brought my autograph book and showed him his brother's signature. I said, just want you to know I got to meet your brother a year before what happened. And he was a wonderful guy. And I showed him the autograph. He's like, wow, man, you just made my day. Thank you. Because, it's
sure.
The love of a sibling is just, it's special. And the last person I met that day was Vader. He picked me up by the scruff of my shirt and got me eye level with him. My father was loving it.
That's great.
Good stuff. And the main event that night was Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Undertaker versus Kane and Mankind. And earlier in the night, Vince was actually in the building. He came out, was knocking the New York crowd. The glass shattered. Steve came out, picked up the mic, went to talk, and stunned Vince. And
That's hilarious.
The whole place exploded. But isn't it ironic that when Vince Jr. was at his most successful, he was on TV every week being made to look like a fool because he represented everyone's hated boss that everyone's got to look at and put up with every day. And the fans were living vicariously through Steve. That's why that works so well. And that's why I'm not trying to get on a tangent, but that's why I always felt that Daniel Bryan worked so well, because people were living vicariously through him. And I feel like the best characters, and JR said this many times, the best characters are where the crowd is emotionally invested in wanting to see them succeed. Once you have the fans emotionally invested that way, it's a license to print money.
Yeah.
And that was a good show. That was a good show I went to.
Was that at MSG, you said?
It was in the Garden. What a building.
Yeah. I've never been. You got one over on me, man. That's of the stuff that I've done in wrestling. I haven't been to MSG yet, so I give you credit, and I give your dad credit, man. That's a pretty cool dad to be taking you to these shows, and give him a lot of credit too for working with those handicapped kids, man. That's great.
Yeah, my dad's a solid man.
Yeah,
good people.
Let me pick up on a few things you said. You mentioned you met Ron Simmons at Vader. Going back a little bit before your memory there, that was the summer of '98. That story you just told.
Mm-hmm.
So summer of '92, and man, I had been to a couple of the Great American Bashes, the Flair Luger Great American Bash pay-per-view. I was there for that in Baltimore, and the next year was a lot better actually. The Flair Funk '89 Bash Glory Days. I was there for that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was
Terry Funk reinvented himself. That guy was a chameleon. He was very underrated.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, Jimmy, when I was watching that happen in live time, I didn't even understand the full greatness of Terry Funk. And I was a fairly educated, young wrestling fan,
mm-hmm.
but it's just one of those generational things. Like, the first time I saw Terry Funk, he's, branding Mel Phillips on TV, and he's feuding with the Junkyard Dog, and he's losing to Moondog Spot at the Wrestling Classic pay-per-view, the first ever WWF pay-per-view you could get at home. So my first impression of Terry Funk was kind of that, more or less somewhat cartoonish WWE version, as opposed to the old NWA Territory version of Terry Funk, right? So when Funk goes over to NWA, as they still called it, although technically they were now WCW. Hold on a second, buddy. Am I still here?
Yeah, you're there.
Okay, great. I didn't really appreciate what Terry Funk, the legacy, the history of Terry Funk. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it was that feud coming off the Steamboat Flair feud to see this older guy, who's not, he was actually in really good shape for him, but he wasn't a muscle-bound Lex Luger or Sting. But to see this guy, Terry Funk, do this stuff, it was really impressive. And the reason why I turned off my... Go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah, he pile drove Flair through the table in Nashville.
Yes, I was watching that on pay-per-view with a friend of mine. That was Wrestle War. And then we did go to the Bash that summer.
Wow.
And this was this '89 Bash. We actually went to two. When I say we, me and my friends, we went to a Bash in Landover, Maryland, the Capitol Center. That's Cornette, I think, in the bottom, raising his hand after the tuxedo. Check this out, Jimmy. The bottom one, that's Cornette and Heyman in that tuxedo match.
Holy crap.
And that is Pillman launching to attack Wild Bill Irwin.
Jeez.
And I have more of these pictures. The problem, buddy, is at some point I took some of these photographs out to get enlarged, but I didn't put them right back in the album. So lesson there, right?
Yeah.
See if you can... I get this reflection, man. Let me know if that is coming off pretty good.
I could see it.
That's the two-ring battle royal.
Mm-hmm.
And with the irony, buddy, is that the best pictures from this thing I don't have because I had them enlarged at one point. But here is Psycho Sid and Danny Spivey, if you can see that
The
one.
Skyscrapers, weren't they managed
Yep.
by Teddy Long?
Correct. Yes, indeed. So I was there for that one. It was a lot of fun. And so the next year came, and it was the Sting Flair thing. And I do want to give a shout out to someone, another friend of mine, unfortunately, has passed away, Brian Danovich, who was actually a wrestler, and he lived not too far from you. He was on Long Island as opposed to Staten Island, where you are. But Danovich was on the Tough Enough season. If you remember the guy that was doing the bench press to the point that he exploded his pec on Tough Enough. Yeah, that was Brian Danovich, and I actually became friendly with him through the wrestling podcast world. And I went up to Long Island to see him. I think in the summer of 2000, I want to say 2018. And bro, I saw him. I crashed the night at his house. We talked about that Sting Flair pay-per-view from 1990 because he was a young guy. He had a bunch of friends over watching. His mom was cooking the food, and this Brian Danovich guy was really into wrestling. I mean, he was a wrestler, and he was in was it OVW where they used to send guys in that 2004 era.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, a few weeks after I saw Danovich in Long Island, he passed away. So it's just tough, man. There's so many guys that it just makes you think about it because things like that, Jimmy. The stories, like for instance, the Hogan turning on Savage. You were pretty young, but you remember it very clearly at 6 or 7 years old. I was a little bit older, and I remember it very clearly. I remember it, and I wasn't even watching it in live time. I was at a different show, wishing I was watching it. You know what I mean?
No, we had it on at home because we had the hot box back then, so we got all the pay-per-views. And let me tell you something. I'll never forget my father, pardon my French, when Hogan hit the leg drop on Savage. Holy shit! Because my father told me he never thought Hogan was ever going to go heel. But when he did, it gave the business the shot in the arm that it was needing.
Yeah, it did. And what I don't know if some WWE fans these days realize is that, and I get a little defensive or upset when people really piss on AEW to the extreme, because if there wasn't an AEW that came around in 2018, I don't think you'd have the Walters or the Gunthers in WWE with this long Intercontinental title reign. I don't think you would have NXT on regular cable as opposed to the WWE network. I think what competition does, even if you favor WWE or whatever it is, when you have competition, it typically makes both things that are competing better, because why wouldn't it? They're competing with each other. And I don't want to just forget totally about Impact Wrestling, because they did put up that flag, that rebel flag, so to speak, against the monarchy of WWE. But I think AEW really took it to another level. And I would say that, a simple answer for that is just money. When, it takes money to make money, and the amount of money that the Cons have through the Jacksonville Jaguars and everything else that they do, it allowed them to get some of those contracts of the guys, like the guy that on my shirt, Chris Jericho. You know what I mean?
No, listen, there's anyone who denies that there's been an AEW effect is lying to not only other people, but they're lying to themselves. Because the bottom line is this. WWE had, and this is what I always say for people that are critical of AEW, and because listen, like I said at the top of this video, when there's criticism to be given out, whether it's AEW, Impact, WWE, I give it. When it's time to praise, I praise. But the bottom line is this. WWE had several years, over a decade's worth, to be the only live television option in pro wrestling. And in a lot of ways, they fumbled the ball. For all the money that they have, which is based off of their TV deals, Arn Anderson himself has talked about how, listen, if they had to make money the old-fashioned way by selling tickets and just telling great stories, they'd have problems. They get the bulk of their money off of their TV deals. So the bulk of their money isn't coming off of the live product. but they had years to prove that they could do it without needing competition. I don't believe Roman Reigns turns heel if there's not an AEW. I don't believe for a single second that they paid closer attention to certain talents if there wasn't an AEW. And the bottom line is the business is better off just for them existing, just them being there, as if to say, hey, you can't sit on your laurels. You cannot rest on your previous achievements. You have to produce. But that should be, to me, maybe I'm a fool. I'll be the first to admit that. That should be the attitude regardless. Because if you're not putting your best foot forward, what are you doing?
You're having the Muppets guest commission on Raw. Let me show you this picture, buddy. We talked about Terry Funk, right?
Yep.
So when I said that the first exposure I had at Terry Funk was when he was in the WWF, that's a picture that I took as kind of an embryo. But that's Terry Funk in the Providence Civic Center in, I want to say, July of 1985, buddy. And I'll show you some more photos of this show. That's the best one I've got of the Sheik, the Iron Sheik and Volkov
doing
in the ring.
Doing the national anthem.
Yep. And bro, this was no cell phone. This was like a kid's. I think it was a disc phone. They used to have. You probably never even heard of these things, buddy. They used to have these cameras that were called the disc, and it was.
I never heard of those before.
Yeah, look it up. It's like somebody's got to have a video about this camera. It wasn't 35 millimeter. It was a disc. It was a regular camera, but the stuff was it clicked like a disc or something. That's Morocco's ass, basically.
The magnificent ass.
Now here's one of these things, man. It's a bittersweet memory. I will give my mom credit because she actually encouraged my wrestling fanism. This is the Providence Civic Center, July of 1985, right?
Yeah.
And my mom actually was with me for my mom, my dad, and my sister. The only time the four of us went to anything like this together was a pro wrestling show, was my first show. That's George Animal Steel.
Eating the turnbuckle.
Right. And this is Morocco in steel, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's Morocco in steel. And then, so basically this is what happened. We, this particular summer, my sister wasn't around. My father was not around. It was me and my mom. I was pretty young and pretty bored, because I was going to school in Virginia. That's where I went to elementary school. That's where my friends were. But in the summers, we'd go up to Rhode Island, and I was pretty isolated. So to kind of balance out my boredom, my mom would do things like take me to the pro wrestling shows. Okay. So, we get the tickets for the Providence Civic Center under the guise that Andre the Giant is going to face Magnificent Morocco in the main event. And the co-main is going to be a World Tag Team title Texas Tornado match, Wyndham and Rotundo versus the Sheik and Volkov. And unfortunately, we go up to Providence, and at the time, Jimmy, Providence was not like the toughest city in the world, but for a single mom, a mom on her own, so to speak, and a young son to go up to Providence, Rhode Island,
kind of rough.
Kind of rough, So I give my mom credit, and we went to some Burger King that I think is still there in Providence. Right down the street, and then we went to the arena. It was not, from what I remember, it wasn't a huge sellout crowd or anything, but it was a decent crowd, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people.
Okay.
I don't know if it was Howard Finkel or not, but the very first thing that happens is the ring announcer gets into the ring and tells us that unfortunately, due to travel issues, Andre the Giant will not be here tonight. But if you want to get a refund, please do. And but we have a very special substitute wrestler tonight, taking the place of Andre the Giant. Now, Jimmy, I should say that the only reason I think my mom had any interest in this affair was that Andre the Giant was going to be there.
And like she had to be pissed.
So I think my mom was disappointed because and I'm pretty young, so I can't really explain to her the whole card subject to change thing, but it's a little bit, disappointing if, like, you're going to go see Andre the Giant. For my mom, that was the big deal, right? She liked Andre and she liked the Killer Bees. So for Andre to no show, it was kind of big. And then it's like, are we really supposed to go get a refund? We've already come out here.
You traveled the whole way. You might as well watch the show.
Right. And so, and man, I've always had a bit of an issue against George the Animal Steel. Like and it's not his fault. He was substituting, and I'm sure he came and he did his thing. He did his, animal best. But I mean, George the Animal Steel compared to Andre the Giant, and
he's not going to win that one.
No, he's not. And and that was the summer before the wheels got in motion for Andre to turn heel and everything. That was summer of '85. So I guess we were still a ways away from that. But it was one of those things, Jimmy, where as a wrestling fan, you get so much and then sometimes you get screwed. And that was probably one of the first times, or probably the first time, that a wrestling show actually disappointed me. Because until then, it was, oh my God, Bob Backlund and Playboy Buddy Rose just wrestled for 35 minutes, and this and that and that and this. And this was like probably the first time that I can really clearly remember, okay, sometimes this wrestling stuff can screw you.
Oh, trust me, I'm living proof of that, because I'm known as one of the biggest critics out there. But the thing is, we don't ask for these. I think that you'll be the first to say, do we ask for these things, Mikey?
No.
I don't think we do, because life gives you enough things to aggravate you.
Right.
We don't ask for these things. We simply react to shit that happens. I think that that's a fair thing to say.
Yeah. Let me tell a few more early wrestling memories, man, and then I'm going to go back to you.
Sure.
This is one that is so obscure that unless you're of a couple of hundred people, nobody's going to know this stuff. When I was a young kid in the summertime, have you ever been to an outdoor wrestling show, Jimmy?
I can't say that I have. No, sir.
Okay. So the first time I went to an outdoor wrestling show was not WWF. It was not NWA. It was nothing like that. It was Killer Kowalski's. I think he called it the IWF, like the one that, terrorizing Triple H came from. But this was a generation before that. This was the first time I went to see these guys was 1986, and they performed at something called the Rocky Hill State Fair and Expo in Rhode Island, like the middle of nowhere, Rhode Island, right? So it's a summer fair. I'm talking 4-H fair with the cows and the fucking horses and the cotton candy and the
kiddie rides.
The kiddie rides. Like the teenagers died on the Ferris wheel last summer. Don't tell anybody. So we go to this thing, and the first year we go, the summer of '86, I can remember that the Pink Assassin wrestled, and the Pink Assassin was kind of the low-rent New England Kowalski Federation version of adorable Adrian Adonis, like the effeminate, wrestler. And the Pink Assassin, well, guess what he wore? He wore all pink. He wore a pink mask and he wore a pink bodysuit. And, some
pretty
of the old
self-explanatory.
Right. So he's the Pink Assassin. So he was doing that, histrionics, as Vince used to say. He was doing that there in '86. And the main event was kind of the hot women's tag team match of the time, like the touring independent women's tag match. It was, I want to say, Misty Blue Sims, who had something called the U.S. Women's Title, which was kind of the unofficial Jim Crockett Women's Title. She teamed up with, I believe the woman was Heidi Lee Morgan, who would go on to lose Alundra Blaze in that women's title tournament in '93. And they faced a team of, I believe, Comrade Olga and her partner, Kat LaRue. And if you look up these four women, Jimmy, in the mid '80s, late '80s, they actually kind of had it was kind of like the Sabu Rob Van Dam thing of its time. You know what I mean? Like that independent match that kind of tours all the indies.
Yeah.
And that was the hot match of that era, was this match, and so I saw it. And what I remember, Jimmy, about watching that is, like, you had to pay money to get into the fair, and then the wrestling was kind of free, like it was part of the fair. But if you didn't pay an extra fee, you sat in the baseball stands pretty far away from the ring. And then if you wanted to like pay an extra $5, you could sit closer to the ring. For whatever reason, we didn't pay the extra $5. We sat in baseball stands, and there was some. I'm a little kid at the time, Jimmy. There was some smart mark, like a 1980s smart mark in the audience, kind of like calling out spots and kind of heckling. And this was my first exposure to a smart mark who's like kind of breaking all the kayfabe stuff. And I'm a little kid, like I'm thinking this guy's a real jerk. And if I was bigger, I might beat him up. But I'm pretty small, so I'm just having to listen to this jerk off. And he had no friends with him. He was just like calling out. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what he was talking about, work rate or giving the match stars or whatever he was doing. But this is the summer of '86, and this guy's doing that.
Unbelievable.
I'll wrap up. It was pretty nuts. I'll just say I went to that show the next 2 summers, 86, 87, and 88. And what stands out in 88, Jimmy, is this is, before cell phones, before the internet, before anything. In the audience of that, Killer Kowalski outdoor, 4-H fair show in Rhode Island of 88, I heard, this is how things used to work, buddy. People used to just tell each other stuff. Like you would find out about things from other human beings. And it's even kind of weird to me to even say that. But what I heard in the audience somehow that night was 2 things. One was that the Sheik had turned on Dusty Rhodes in Detroit, and somehow Dick Murdoch was now a good guy. So there was this angle going on in Crockett that hadn't been broadcast yet. And then the other thing that I heard in the audience was that Bruiser Brody and Adrian Adonis had just died. And there was really no details, but I actually found out as a wrestling fan at a wrestling show about the deaths of Adonis and Brody by just going to a show. And then, later on, it would come out in the wrestling magazines.
That's that reminds me of a sad summer memory myself. Well, May's not considered the summer, but I tell you, it was a hot May in '99 when we lost Owen. I remember watching that live on pay-per-view, and I'll never forget this cold feeling come over me when JR looked into the camera and said, I have the unfortunate responsibility to let everyone know that Owen Hart has died.
Yep.
And I remember particularly that night, it was the most emotional, the day he lost to Roman Reigns, which I wish I could forget, that I saw The Undertaker actually look emotional when he was standing in the ring, and he was actually looking at the corner where Owen landed. I mean, I'm no one to say if the show should have went on or not. I know if it was me, I would have said, everybody go home.
Right.
That's just me. I'm no one to tell anyone what they should do. But out of respect for the human being that we just lost, literally, that made me sick to my stomach. And then the next night, to see Mark Henry crying, and to see Triple H crying, and to see Chyna crying, to see Deborah crying, and as much as I don't like him, to see Jeff Jarrett a mess of tears, and and then to see Steve Austin come out at the end of the show and he looked like he was choked up because there was a lot of unresolved tension between him and Owen because of what happened. I can only imagine what he was feeling because he had a friendship with Owen, and then that kind of got wrecked because Owen, by Brett's own words, he told Owen, you got to call him. He didn't call Steve after the injury, and that messed up their relationship because Owen didn't seem to care that he hurt him, and in many ways shortened Steve's career. But that particular piece of business was sad. As I grew to learn about it, when I heard what went on with Bruiser Brody, I'm like, how the hell was no one arrested? How the hell was Carlitos Colon allowed to get away with that? Like, I don't care, how much of a pain in the ass Brody was. There's no justifying murdering a human being over a fucking wrestling finish.
Yeah, it was just to clarify, Colon was one of the promoters, but it was, I believe the guy's name was Jose Gonzalez was the murderer of Brody.
Jose Gonzalez was the one that actually did the deed?
Yeah, he's the one that stabbed Brody. Colon kind of covered in a sense because Gonzalez was one of the promoters along with Colon. And let's put it this way: I guess what we can say is that Colon and others didn't exactly cooperate or were forthright in getting Gonzalez prosecuted because he was their business partner. But the one that actually murdered Brody was Jose Gonzalez. And believe it or not, Jimmy, I actually saw that guy wrestle live uh, because a little known fact, but it's on YouTube and anywhere you can find video. Jose Gonzalez as Invader 1 and his partner Invader 2 were in the WWF as a tag team in 1983. They wore the masks. They were actually a really awesome tag team. They were high flyers before there were, high flying tag teams.
Mm-hmm.
The closest I can give them to was compare them to is like the British Bulldogs.
Okay.
And as a real young wrestling fan watching
Another
the
great
WWF,
tag team.
yes, the Bulldogs were awesome. But at the time, it was almost like the tag team division was so slim, like just slim pickings, not a lot of teams, that it's almost like, okay, here's the champions, here's the next team that's going to beat them for the title, and then this other team is going to beat that team. Like it was very predictable.
It was easy to predict where it was going to go because, like you said, it was slim pickings at that time.
Right.
It's kind of like it is right now. Like I could totally tell you right now that eventually Kevin Owens is going to turn on Sami Zayn, and if Imperium stays together, I could see Imperium taking the tag belts from them.
Yeah, they could do the old Barry Windham Lex Luger job. Let me tell you some more wrestling memories, man. In the summertime, there was a show not too long ago. I mean, it's going on 8 or 9 years ago now. I'm trying to. It was, I believe, it was. It's actually a really good wrestling group. It's called Big Time Wrestling. It's out of New England, Massachusetts. But these guys actually do really good shows, and they do shows as far south as South Carolina, North Carolina. And their typical business model is they bring in, like Mick Foley or Bret Hart, and then they'll get like FTR. I don't know if you remember last year they had like Ricky Steamboat's retirement match. Like he did a 6-man tag with FTR, and Nick Aldis was in it. And I think it was like Steamboat, and it was a 6-man tag. And Ricky Steamboat at age like 65 or whatever had like one more match last year. That was a big time wrestling show, and that show was actually on the Fight app, pay-per-view type of thing.
Wow.
But this big time wrestling group was kind of based out of Webster, Massachusetts, and in the summer, I want to say of 2015, they did an outdoor. This was the chain of events. They did an outdoor show on a Saturday.
Okay.
And I believe the main event was Justin Credible was their champion at the time, and Justin was actually in pretty good shape in this era, right? And I will have to correct myself. It was more like 2011, not 2015. So Justin Credible is defending the title, and then Scott Hall does a run-in. And, Scott Hall's a little bit older, but he's still Scott Hall, right? And he still comes in with the music. And the gimmick was Justin Credible was kind of the unofficial 6th member of the Clique, which some people know that, some people don't. But Justin Credible was kind of a fringe, you know what I mean? Like they don't really put him over as being one of the big 5 members of the Clique, but he kind of carried their bags type of thing. Mm-hmm. So Scott Hall comes out to help Credible. And then we hear the song Desperado over the speakers. And this is in a baseball stadium somewhere in Massachusetts, like a AAA baseball stadium. And it's Terry Funk comes out. and Jimmy, this was an unannounced, unpromoted cameo from Terry Funk. And I'm like, this is insane. Like the show was pretty good, right? But it's your typical indie show. Like there was Marty Jannetty wrestling Sky Wagner Brown. You know what I mean? So like you had a couple of guys of note, and then a lot of locals. And then, oh yeah, we're just gonna throw, the 65-year-old Terry Funk, who, for no apparent reason, no promotion, nothing.
Just
He's gonna do
bonus.
Yeah, just as a bonus. At the time, Jimmy, I got to mention this. There was in New England, I don't know if you ever saw this character because you're in New York, but Staten Island. There was a wrestling robot, like this guy who had like a full on robot outfit, and somehow he wrestled in this damn thing.
How?
And I don't know.
How? That's my first question. How did he sell an arm drag takedown?
It was so nuts. A friend of mine who was I had this friend named Tom at the time. He was a non-wrestling fan, but he came to the show with me kind of just out of morbid curiosity, because I think I had worn him down with all my wrestling illusions over the years.
You're like, all right, I got to see what the whole fuss is about. Yeah.
So he comes to this thing. He meets the wrestling robot, and Tom was an actor, so he had an appreciation for the interesting entertainment. Right. So he meets the wrestling robot, and then he sees Terry Funk. And then we hung out for a few minutes, like after the show, because it's like 400 or 500 fans, and not too many people are hanging out. Well, I hang out, and Tom's with me, and we actually talked to Terry Funk for a couple of minutes. And the prior time I had met Terry Funk was '89, after the Great American '89 Bash, when I'm like really small, and my friend Tom is talking to Terry Funk for a few minutes, and we laughed. I said, I know you don't really get this, but you just talked to like one of the top 25 wrestlers of all time at the very first show you just went to. I know you don't really totally get it, but that's kind of like, that's a big deal,
Not that I'm trying to push aside your story, because it's a great story, but I love when I hear people like yourself give Terry the love that he deserves, because I firmly believe guys like him, Harley Race, Dusty Rhodes, they are like just pushed aside in terms of the top rankings of all time. Like in my book, if you're going to go all time, all promotions, Dusty's top 10.
Oh, sure.
Easily. Ric Flair's top 10. Easily. Yeah, wow. To be able to meet Terry Funk, I wish I would have had that chance, because a few years ago, I used to have the NWA Championship replica belt. I no longer do. I don't want to get into why I don't. But I had that belt. And one of the reasons I wanted that belt was because of Terry Funk. These were my NWA champions that I just had the utmost respect for, because they carried the belt with pride, and they made you feel like the belt was all that mattered. Flair, Dusty, Harley, and Terry. Those four. I understand Lou Thesz. I understand Gene Kiniski. I understand those guys held the belt longer. But the guys I just mentioned, those are the guys that I think about when I think of NWA. Sure. And Jack Briscoe, of course, Dory Funk Jr. as well. But wow, your friend, his first wrestling show, he meets Terry Funk. Wow.
And I just thought it was so absurd. And just as a follow-up on that story, the next day, Justin Credible lived in Connecticut at the time, and he's kind of a friend of mine. He's a friend of my friend David Gear, and I've talked to Justin a few times. He's a really nice guy.
I'm sure.
But he's had his struggles. But Justin, at the time, was the manager of a restaurant. He's wrestling part-time, and he put together a wrestling convention. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go to Justin Credible's wrestling convention. And I don't know what it was, Jimmy. Like, I think this was right before GPS. You know what I mean? Like on the cusp of GPS. Yeah. So I don't think I had one, or if I did, I didn't know how to work it right.
Back then it was road maps, baby.
It was, yeah, or you'd print up the Yahoo Maps or something, right? So I think I got really frustrated. It was one of those deals, Jimmy, where the convention was about an hour south of where I lived. I lived in Rhode Island. Those states are so small. Connecticut, just over the line. The convention was about an hour from me. I left kind of late, and I got there, and I got lost, and I got to the convention right when it was ending. But I did see a few interesting things. I saw Bob Backlund and Justin were having a conversation when I got there. I saw Scott Hall for another minute, and I said, like, Scott, was talking to somebody, and I said something to Scott like, "Hey, man, remember those American Starship days?" I don't know if you ever heard of this, but Scott Hall's first thing in wrestling was in a tag team with Danny Spivey called American Starship, and they were both, rookies, and they were both jacked up and huge. And when I said that to Scott, because I don't think a lot of people ever brought that up to him, he said, "Oh yeah, man, that's back when my thighs were huge." So I had that.
Wow.
The wrestlers are funny. They always like to, talk about their thighs or some other body part. And Axel Rotten was there, and Axel is a cool guy too. And I said something, I said hi to Axel. Somewhere I have a picture. Axel had just gotten a tattoo like here, and it said in cursive Baltimore. So because that's where he's from. So Axel Rotten had this Baltimore tattoo. ODB for the TNA fans was there. Old dirty a bitch, I guess. And the interesting thing, buddy, and I try not to say this in an insulting way, but when I was a young wrestling fan, the big, belle du jour was Missy Hyatt. I mean, she was just a smoke show. She was, yeah. So try not to be mean, but like the 2010 version of Missy Hyatt was not quite the smoke show. I mean, give her credit; she's still alive. You know what I mean? But she was, and it was
that's
still
only natural. That's only natural when time goes by.
Yeah. But I mean, I give her credit; she was there. She was nice. But yeah, man, and that was that summer of 2010. So now I want to hand back the mic, so to speak, to you, buddy. Give you some more summertime wrestling memories.
Sure. I've got a few more. I actually have my own wrestling convention story from the summertime. See, because here in Staten Island, they really didn't have them that often, if any. But I do remember that in New Jersey, they had a wrestling convention in the summer, and I went with my father. We met Tito Santana. We met Colt Cabana. We met the late great Howard Finkel, who was really, 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 really nice. My sister drew a nice portrait for him. She handed it to him as a gift. And this is when my sister was starting with her art, but she was even good then. And he was appreciative. And he looks at me and he says, "You don't have to be nervous. Ask me anything you want." I says, "But I don't want to be insulting. I have questions about wrestlers, but they're not you." He's like, "Oh, please. I announced the wrestlers. That's my job." So I said, "All right, I have one question for you," because I hadn't met the man yet. I said, "What is it like to be in the presence of The Undertaker?" And he looked at me and he says, "Well, let me tell you something. Whether you're in the ring announcing him and that gong goes off and the lights go down, it's an experience." He says, "But getting to know the man himself, he's even more incredible." That was one. We also met Cornette. I actually brought the NWA Championship with me. I knew I was going to meet him because I knew he was on the card for the list of appearances, and he saw the belt I was carrying. He's like, "Oh, that's a nice piece of history." So I asked Cornette, and I said, "Corny, I got to ask you a question." He says, "And please know I am not trying to aggravate you. I just want a straight answer. Who's worse, John Laurinaitis or Kevin Dunn?" He looks at me and he says, "Well, what would you rather be shot with, a handgun or a shotgun?" And Cornette was just, she's like, "All right, I need to know, who are some of your favorite wrestlers?" Like, "Well, I love Mick Foley." He's like, "I love me some Mick Foley. I knew when he was coming in." He tells me, "I knew when he was coming into the WWF. I knew he was going to be something special if he had a chance." And then I told him the Undertaker was my favorite. And he says, "There's no more solid human being than him." And then I told him I enjoyed Bret. He says, Bret took himself a little too seriously, but he was a tremendous performer. And then I told him that my other favorite wrestler was Bryan Danielson, Daniel Bryan. He says, "You want to know what epitomizes Bryan? Love. He loves wrestling." And I was actually wearing a Daniel Bryan shirt that day. And then I'll never forget, it was another convention. I think it was the year prior. I think it was 2012 in the summertime, where I got to meet Sting. He's my second favorite wrestler of all time, right behind The Undertaker. I enjoyed his surfer gimmick because he was great with the blonde flat top, the colorful stuff. But I'm also a big fan of comic books. And The Crow is one of my favorites, if not my favorite single comic of all time. And
Right.
when Sting reinvented himself, which in wrestling, when you're successful to the degree he was as the Surfer, and then you reinvent, you throw that all out and you start fresh, that's a gamble. And that very easily could have killed his career. But it took off. And here was a guy that used to do loud and vibrant promos, and now he was not saying a word. When I saw him as the hero, and this is another summer memory from '97 when he came down from the ceiling and baseball batted the whole NWO. I think that's when Dennis Rodman was with them as their mascot. And he dropped everyone,
Yep.
Savage, Hall, Nash, then Hogan. That was a big deal. And I loved Sting. So when I met him, this is kind of me, as much as I hate to use the word because I think it's an insulting word, but this was kind of me being a mark for a second. Sting walks in the room and he says, "How's everybody doing?" Everyone was quiet. So I said, "I cannot believe that I'm standing in front of you." So without missing a beat, what does he say? "Well, guess what? I can't believe I'm standing in front of you." And I had the world heavyweight, the big gold belt over my shoulder because that was the belt I associated with him. I always felt that when I'm going to meet a wrestler, if I have the championship that they're associated with, I feel like it's better to have that with me. That's just how my mind operated, especially when I had a lot of replicas. I no longer have as many as I used to. But I met Sting. I told him, I says, "I got to tell you something, man. Every Monday night, when I was glued to the TV just to see what you were going to do at WCW. I was a fan of his work in TNA. I thought he did a great job there. Selfishly, and this is just me admitting my selfishness, I selfishly wish he would have went to the WWE in 2011 just so we could have got that one match with The Undertaker. That was the dream match that I always wanted to see. I wanted that match from when I was a kid. And he saw on the big gold belt that I had Taker's name on there, and that was by design. I told him, I says, "You and him are my all-time favorites." And I said, "I just wonder what would happen. What if?" And he says, "You know what would happen." Sting was such a great guy. And as I was walking away from Sting, who comes over and shakes my hand? Tully Blanchard.
Oh, wow.
That was one. Now we're talking about the summertime, and you mentioned 2011. There was something else that happened in 2011. A certain Chicago wrestler sitting on a stage in Las Vegas,
Oh, yeah.
letting the world know what he thought of John Cena and how the WWE infrastructure worked. And I'll never forget sitting in my room with my best friend, Christian, watching this play out. And I'm like this the whole time saying, "Chris, is he saying this? Are they allowing this?" And I'm like, this is all stuff that we were thinking as fans, because I think most people will admit 2011, 2012, people were sick of John Cena. They weren't booing him because it was the fun thing to do, because I think we could both agree, if it was a fad, it would have died
Right.
out. It went on for years. Like from 2006 onward, he was getting a visceral hate your guts reaction. And when Punk cut that promo in Las Vegas, and then his mic got cut, I remember just sitting there saying to myself, he just became the biggest babyface in that company, because he was basically saying what all of the audience was thinking about the product. None of us had a problem with The Rock coming back. The fact that he was going to be in the main event of WrestleMania, just walking through the front door, I personally didn't think that was needed, because I knew The Rock was going to draw the same amount of money whether he was in the main event or not. I knew that. I think we all pretty much knew that. I don't think The Rock was going to draw one dime less being second to last. It was clear that John was being forced. I mean, anyone who says otherwise is kidding themselves. I mean, at least in my estimation, when you're the top babyface, you shouldn't be getting booed. And if you actually look at history, you look at Steve Austin, he was a heel. People started liking him. They made him a good guy. Hulk Hogan, arguably biggest babyface of all time. I think you could make a fair argument to say that he's the biggest babyface in history. But when people got sick of him, he changed. Even The Rock, on 2 separate occasions, when he was Rocky Maivia, and he was smiling and waving at the fans, they didn't buy it. They started chanting, "Die, Rocky, die." He became a heel. Even in the summer of 2002, another summer memory when The Rock wrestled Brock Lesnar. And The Rock faced Brock Lesnar at SummerSlam 2002. I remember watching this live on pay-per-view, and the fans were booing the hell out of The Rock. The Rock got beat by Brock Lesnar, and the pay-per-view went to dark. But what most people don't know is that when the cameras went down, for the live feed anyway, they kept recording when The Rock was coming up from getting beat. And what happened was he started doing his catchphrase and the crowd was booing him. And then The Rock turned around and said, "You know what? Sing along with the champ is over." So The Rock knew when it was time. Hogan knew when it was time. Bret the Hitman Hart knew when it was time to change. Like at WrestleMania 13, when he fought Steve Austin, he got booed one night in Chicago. 2 weeks later, he reformed the Hart Foundation. There wasn't this back and forth between the audience. And that's why, to me, and I don't want to get into a Cena tangent, but that's why I'll always have a certain level of criticism for John Cena, because he was the first wrestler that the fans had no sway over. And I feel like that was wrong, because if the fans were, and this was always my philosophy, and I invite you to correct me if I'm mistaken. If the crowd was allowed to get sick of Hogan and he changed, with all due respect, who's
I'm with you. I'm with you, Jimmy. I had a little technical issue, just so you know, but I'm back now. And I would say that from my, are you still here, Jimmy? Sorry, but
Yeah, I think I got kicked off there for a second.
I'm putting you back in, Jimmy. Hold on, buddy. From my perspective, having a little bit of video trouble here. Hopefully it's clearing up. There you go. Sorry about that, Jimmy.
No, it's okay.
I'm trying to get our post displayed. I'm having a little bit of a technical issue on my end. Here we go. We're back. Thanks. My friend Carl's just chimed in. Carl's a Chicago guy, actually.
Hello, Carl.
And Carl was actually at WrestleMania 22. And, you know, the funny thing is, Jimmy, speaking of WrestleMania 22, in my opinion, that's when John Cena started getting a lot of, hate from the fans. If you see the WrestleMania 22, the original pay-per-view broadcast, I don't know if they've tweaked the audio, but at WrestleMania 22, Triple H against John Cena for the lineage Bruno belt, as I call it, and the fans are booing both guys. Like it just seemed like the fans in Chicago that night, of which our buddy Carl here is one of, they were not feeling that match or feeling those two guys. And the match turned out to be actually a great match. But when that match first started, the fans are booing them both out of the arena. And from my memory, Jimmy, that and then the Rob Van Dam match, the second ECW One Night Stand, and then everything after, it seemed like the fans, and they always try to revisionist history at Jimmy and say it was 50-50. But from where I was standing, it was like 75-25.
Oh, it absolutely was. It absolutely was. And what gets me more than anything, and I mentioned this when the feed got cut, I always have had this stance on it. If the fans were allowed to get sick of Hogan, with all due respect, who is John Cena compared to Hulk Hogan? Hulk Hogan ushered in two completely different boom periods to pro wrestling, the 80s and the 90s. You could make a case that Hulk Hogan's the greatest of all time, and people got sick of him. So for me, I always say, if, Kevin Nash himself said this this was a WWE roundtable, I think it was with Mean Gene, J.J. Dillon, JR, and Michael Hayes, and Kevin Nash, that Hogan was going to the ring and getting a negative reaction, and Kevin Nash flat out said they weren't buying the red and yellow anymore. It was time for a change. What I don't understand, and I see people do this with sports, with basketball, with movies, they lower the standard of greatness for modern people And I feel like that's a disservice to the guys that came before. It's like with basketball. LeBron James has lost 6 NBA finals. How is he remotely comparable to Michael Jordan when Michael Jordan is 6-0? How is he comparable to someone like a Larry Bird when Larry Bird, yes, he only has 3 titles, but guess what? Larry Bird didn't have an ounce of quit in him. Magic has 5 rings in 12 years. LeBron James has 4 in 20 years total. So, these are all legends. Michael Jordan, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Russell, Magic Johnson, Kobe Bryant, late great, and Larry Bird. They accomplished more in less time than him, but now I'm supposed to buy that he's better than all of them? It's like John Cena. Whenever he comes back, they bring out this GOAT stuff. How could John Cena be the GOAT when the audience got smaller and the business became less popular? So when Punk cut that promo in the summer of 2011, it just rang so true to me and so many others because, number one, they were sick of him, and number two, they were dying for a change because WWE really, if you remember, they weren't, as for the money, for whatever money they were making, their product was not must-see anymore. And Punk, when he cut that promo, it became must-see because you wanted to know what else he was going to say, which is how wrestling should feel. That's why Austin and McMahon work so well, because you wanted to see what these crazy sons of bitches were going to do the next week. So,
Hey, Jim. Yeah. Jimmy, do you, that whole PG era, to me, that was not a good era. And remember about 2 years, I think it's actually been about a year or two at this point, where the internet was saying that the PG era was officially over for WWE, but yet it seems like it's still officially PG. Maybe they have loosened the rein, so to speak, on the PG stuff, but I don't
yeah.
think they ever officially went non-PG. Am I right in saying that?
No, they didn't. And the truth of the matter is the PG stuff, the PG rating is really a crutch. Because I got news for you. We talked earlier about how 96 and 97 set up the WWF to do well. Guess what the rating was at that time? It was a PG product. And that just shows you it's not the rating that was holding them back. It was the writing that was holding them back. Because
Right.
being PG didn't stop them from putting CM Punk as the WWE champion in the main event. The PG rating didn't force them to put Punk in the middle of the card while he was the world champion, but the main event was Johnny Ace versus John Cena. That to me, the rating was always used as a crutch to explain away John's failures as a babyface. The bottom line was people just didn't get into his gimmick, and that's okay. People didn't get into The Rock's gimmick when he first showed up. But guess what they did? He adapted to the audience. Okay, you people don't like me. Now I'm going to give you a reason not to like me. He became The Rock. The rest is history. So, and again, the summer of 2002, I think it was the Meadowlands when The Rock fought Brock Lesnar in the main event. When Brock Lesnar beat The Rock, they were booing The Rock out of the building because they were sick to death that he was leaving them for Hollywood. And when the cameras went off, this is on The Rock's DVD, that when The Rock was starting to get back up, the crowd was showering him in boos. He picked up the microphone and he said, "You know what? Singing along with The Rock is over." And the fans cheered as he was leaving because they wanted him out. So
Right.
again, I ask a very simple question. If the fans were allowed to get sick of guys like Hogan and Bret and The Rock, bona fide legends, you could make a case that The Rock is Mount Rushmore. You could make a case that Bret is top 10. I believe he's top 10. You could make a case that Hogan's top 2. But if the fans were allowed to get sick of them, I ask a simple question. What made John so special? Make-A-Wish? Hogan did tons of it. Charity? The Rock did ton of it. I don't like when people use things like that as a shield to kind of explain away what was. And Punk cut that promo in the summer of 2011, and it should have went on to bigger and better things, but he ended up being a mid-card WWE champion, which really, it's to this day, it still sticks in my craw because he could have been so much more. In my book, he could have been so much more because he was getting sponsorship offers. the audience was unanimously behind him, which is what wrestling had been starved for since Austin and The Rock left the industry.
Right.
And to me, it came down to this. And I don't know if you agree with this assessment. This is me psychoanalyzing Vince. When Lesnar left in 2004, Vince made a conscientious decision that he was never going to allow anyone else to be bigger than the brand for fear that they would have the ability to say, no, I'm not doing your stupid idea, or B, I'm not doing a job, or C, you know what, I'm just picking up and leaving because I got all the star power I need. Vince's modus operandi after Lesnar left, when they poured everything into him, never again. And that's why Cena was forced, and that's why Roman Reigns was forced. And that's just my assessment. And Punk cutting that promo in Las Vegas, to me, that was one of the last shining lights of them actually acknowledging, no pun intended, yes, fans, we hear what you're saying. But they heard, but they didn't listen.
Right. They didn't act. And they didn't act upon what they heard. And I do agree with you, Jimmy. In fact, I would point to a very recent example of this, of what I call burying someone alive, is what I call it. And that's when you're pushing a wrestler. WWE specifically does this. You're pushing them. You're going along with the program of pushing that wrestler. But at the same time, you're kind of making them not so great. You're undercutting them a little bit just so that the WWE, meaning Vince and Triple H and whoever else,
still has control over it.
Still has control over them. And I give a very clear example of Becky Lynch. When Becky Lynch was on her road to WrestleMania, and she gets punched right before the Survivor Series, and
with the blood and all that.
Right. And she was the big thing, okay? From going from SummerSlam of whatever year that was into the WrestleMania, and she had to drop out of the Survivor Series. Charlotte takes her place. I get that. But then everybody really just wanted to see Becky Lynch beat Ronda Rousey in the main event of WrestleMania, whatever year that was, 2015, I think.
I know it was 2019.
2019. Wow, was that was recent? Okay. So the thing is, Jimmy, at the beginning of that year, the Royal Rumble of 2019, I can't believe I remember all this stuff. Becky Lynch, I think, is on the very first match of that 2019 Royal Rumble.
And she lost to Asuka.
By submission. Now, would you ever have a babyface, even a John Cena babyface, or a Hulk Hogan babyface, or a Bruno Sammartino, or a Bob Backlund? Well, I guess in Bob Backlund's case, they threw in the towel, but they did not have Backlund even say, I quit or I submit. They never had Hogan quit or submit. To have Becky Lynch...
Not back then, no.
Right. But even now, and I get it, that submissions are not the biggest deal anymore, but still, if you're having this, Becky Badass going around and she's losing by submission, she really wants to be champion, but then she's going to quit. Why couldn't she get pinned? And then later in the card, she kind of jumps into the Women's Royal Rumble and wins it, right? Okay.
Which was the right call.
Yes. And then they have their match. And then not to say that, I was okay with it being a Ronda Rousey, Charlotte Flair, Becky Lynch three-way. I was relatively okay with it, although I think most fans wanted to just see straight up one-on-one, which I still don't think they've done Ronda versus Becky one-on-one.
No, they haven't, and that was a missed opportunity. And a matter of fact, not to cut you off, but WWE actually conducted a poll on their own website at that time. What do you want to see? And Ronda, they gave you three options. Ronda versus Becky. They gave you Ronda versus Charlotte, or a three-way. Right. Ronda versus Becky won in a landslide. A triple threat was a distant second. And a one-on-one between Charlotte and Ronda was even more distant than that. So they knew the fans wanted the match between Becky and Ronda. But the problem is, again, it's the Roman Reigns and John Cena syndrome with Charlotte Flair, though. They wanted Charlotte in that first ever women's main event. And that's why they convoluted that whole story with the doctor and the knee and getting Stephanie and Triple H involved, which really just, to me, it took away from the whole story. So they did all of that extra crap so they can insert Charlotte in there. Meanwhile, the simpler, more logical thing to do would have been Charlotte has a rematch with Asuka from the year before. This time you make the right decision. You have Asuka beat her instead of making her lose like you did the year before, which was silly. They had Asuka win the Rumble just to tap out, which
Right.
I still don't understand that. And you do Ronda versus Becky one-on-one. That was the match people wanted to see. You know, I'm not a proponent of just, let's just give them the main event because they're women. No, that was the hottest story that they had at that time. Even more so than Kofi Mania, even more so than Seth Rollins against Brock Lesnar. When it came to card structure, that was one of the few nights where their card structure was spot on. Where,
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
And here's how they buried Becky alive. And Jimmy, I guess it was 2019 because at that point I'd been doing some of these wrestling rants, and I came up with this term in a wrestling rant at the time that I actually filmed en route from Rhode Island to Florida, I think in a hotel in Fayetteville, North Carolina, or some such place. But I get into the hotel, I'm in the middle of travel, I turn on the TV, and there's Becky Lynch with a crutch. And then I went on YouTube or wherever I saw this, that at house shows, Becky was actually struggling to remember which knee was supposed to be screwed up.
Yep.
Because her limp was going back and forth between the two knees. And people, you know, the internet fans, whatever, were kind of like, this is really lame. This knee injury is stupid. She doesn't have an injured knee. She's not selling it very well. Why should she be? And then that is, and I said this at the time, Jimmy, even before WrestleMania happened that year, I said, they're burying Becky alive. And people, what do you mean by that? I said, they're going to give her the belt. She's going to leave WrestleMania with the belt. I thought they might have had her pin Charlotte and not Ronda, or the two belts. They're going to have Becky win these two belts, but they are not giving her what Steve Austin got before he beat Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 14.
Which was the proper push of a one-on-one feud and just beating the champion straight up.
Yes, and you don't have to, like, for instance, Shawn Michaels and Triple H and Tyson did that thing where they kind of tied up Austin in the ropes and kissed his bald head in Times Square, or whatever that was, leading up to WrestleMania 14. So it's not that the babyface has to go in like a world beater and the heel has nothing against him at all.
Of course.
But the way that I say it, they buried Becky alive. They pushed her, but they're still kind of undercutting her because she can be the number one wrestler in the company. She can be the number one women's wrestler, bigger than Wendy Richter, bigger than Chyna, bigger than everybody. But they still want her to know that they're the boss and she's the worker. And they don't want. At the time, Jimmy, I don't think there even was an AEW to compete with. So it's not like Becky had any choices unless she wanted to pack her bags and go to Japan or quit the wrestling business altogether and try Hollywood. But she seemed like a loyal enough individual to the company. But why couldn't they, I think it's Austin used to use that term, strap the rocket ship to her ass. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And here's the other part of the Becky Lynch thing. Is that at that WrestleMania, my friend Cody PX Odo, who was the producer of Messier Mantra for many years, he went to that show. He went to that WrestleMania where Becky won the titles. He drove from Rhode Island to New York, got his ticket. I'm not sure, who he went with, but he said that
he had to be dead by the time that show was over because that was a 7-hour show.
Exactly, and that's what I asked him. I said, man, how was that? What was that experience like? Because it was a 7-hour show, and he said, Mike, by the time the main event came around, people were falling asleep in the stands. Like they were literally sleeping, and I'm like, okay, so it's almost like a backhanded compliment or the tallest midget in the room type of thing. No offense to rooms or to midgets. But if you're going to put the women for the first time ever main eventing a WrestleMania, but it's at, we're going to do 6.5 hours of other matches. I mean, it's almost like you'd rather go on first. You know what I mean? Like to be the main event after 6.5 hours of other matches. That's what I call burying alive, buddy. And I think it's something that the WWE has done. Maybe when Vince is finally 100% gone, he's like Jason Voorhees, man. Like a year
Son of a
ago,
bitch
people.
keeps coming back.
Yeah, I want to give a couple of. I don't know how much time you have, Jimmy. I mean, this has been a lot of fun, but I don't want to. I see it's getting dark out there, man. So I don't want to keep you if the whole night's going on. But just a couple of more things, and maybe we'll do as part two of this. But I have all these memories, so much fun. I do want to say a couple of, in case I always want to leave people with things that they can watch, and I will
Sure,
give a
sure.
couple of recommendations on the WCW NWA side. I always go to this. There's a Clash of Champions from June of 1992. It's the only Clash of Champions WCW from 1992 June. So it's the NWA World Tag Team Title Tournament.
Okay.
And then about 2 weeks later, they had maybe more than 2 weeks later, they had the Great American Bash pay per view. And between the Clash and the pay per view of Great American Bash 92, they had this NWA World Tag Team Title Tournament. And I'm not going to spoil it because if there's young fans out there, they may not know who wins. But you had teams like the Malenkos, Dean Malenko, and his less known older brother, Joe Malenko.
Okay.
You had Ricky Steamboat and Nikita Koloff as a tag team. You had Gordy and Doc, the Miracle Violence connection. You had the Steiners. You had Barry Windham and Dustin Rhodes. You had the Jimmy Garvin, Michael Hayes version of the Freebirds. You had, I believe, Steve Austin and Rick Rude were in this tournament as a team together.
Right.
Eaton and Arn Anderson. So for the fans who want to see like some solid old school Bill Watts era, I know he gets a lot of flack, but if you really just want to see some good wrestling matches, watch them in order because the first round of the tournament is on the Clash of June of '92, and then the final three rounds are on the pay per view, which also has Sting versus Big Van Vader for the world title. And I'm not going to spoil it. I know that you and I probably know the results, but for the younger fans, I want to give them the chance to see it and not know the results. And then we might want to save this for the next one, Jimmy, because I'd like to get your take on this. But if people want to watch this, and maybe we'll do a part two in a couple of weeks together,
Sure.
is the Calgary Stampede 1997. My God, what a tight show.
Yes.
Oh my God, and Jimmy, man, it's been so many years, but I can remember watching that one with my dad in the summer of '97. I
As
can
did I.
remember, yep, I can remember that I went to the gym before that show, and I was kind of pumping myself up because I knew that I had a really good wrestling show, but I didn't know that it was going to be that good.
Oh
Um,
yeah, it was a really, really
that-
good show.
oh my God, and I think I could be wrong, Jimmy, but I think that show starts with the Undertaker versus Vader for the title. Is that about right?
That wasn't the opening match, but it was a match on the card, and it was probably the best match that Taker and Vader ever had. And I gotta tell you, I remember watching that show, and I told my dad, I think the Undertaker's going to lose, and he said, "Why?" Because he can't tombstone Vader. Oh, was I wrong? And it just goes to show you how strong that dude is. Because I think Leon White at that time was like 450, and Taker tombstoned him and didn't break his neck. And I think that was back when I think this was after Paul Bear's face was burned by Taker, and Paul was managing Vader at that time.
Yes, he
I
was. You're right.
it was just I remember watching that match, and it's just this was right after Paul Bear revealed that Kane was alive.
Yeah,
You want to talk about a summer moment? That
yeah,
was the beginning of one of the greatest stories. To hell with the bloodline, the story of the Undertaker and Kane.
yeah.
Oh my good God in heaven! But that Calgary main event, when it was Austin, Shamrock, Goldust, and the LOD versus the Foundation, the Hart Foundation. Let me tell you something. We encounter a few wrestling fans. They say Bret Hart's not top 100, which I think is an asinine statement to make.
Yeah.
Bret is one of the greatest storytellers in history. He's the greatest in the Hart family, in my view. Owen is very close because Owen was great. Owen wasn't a good babyface, but he was an excellent heel. Bret was great at both. Bret was great as a villain. He proved that when he was in the tag team with Jim Neidhart, with Jimmy Hart as the manager, and he proved it in this incarnation of the Hart Foundation, the 5-man group with Brian Pillman, Jim Neidhart, British Bulldog, and Owen, and he was a great babyface. But this match, you could feel the buzz when Austin and Bret went face to face, and man, like you said, what a great match. Not to try to go back in time again, but you mentioned 92 WCW. I got something else that they could watch as well.
Please do.
Beach Blast 1992. Beach Blast. That match features an incredible Iron Man match with Ravishing Rick Rude, the U.S. Heavyweight Champion, and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, with JR and Jesse the Body Ventura on commentary. Mikey, the first time I ever saw this match, it was not when it happened, because I wasn't watching wrestling live at 2 years old. I just wasn't. But when I finally saw this match, because I'm a big fan of Ricky Steamboat, and I love Ravishing Rick Rude, to me, he's one of the best bad guys ever.
You still there, Jimmy? I lost Jimmy for a second. Jimmy was talking about the 1992 Bash at the Beach, Ricky Steamboat versus Rick Rude Iron Man Challenge match. Let me see if Jimmy's still here. Might have cut out, but I'm not sure if you're hearing me or Jimmy or both. But that pay-per-view was a great show, 1992. So yeah, actually, you could watch those three in order. You could watch the 1992 Bash at the Beach WCW, and then the Clash of Champions from June 92, and then the Great American Bash 92, which is a really nice trilogy of shows from that era. I'm just going to give Jimmy another chance. Folks, this has been a lot of fun. We might have had, I know Jimmy was doing this from outside. I really appreciate him, kind of bearing the weather up there in Staten Island. I was telling Jimmy before we went on the air that I watched the movie The King of Staten Island with Pete Davidson, and that was really a good film. I'll give Jimmy another minute to see if he pops back in. This has been a lot of fun. I'm going to watch, for folks who are watching this on delay, I do want to thank my buddy Carl Kate, who's done some videos with me before. I'm going to be doing more of these live streams. I've kind of taken a break from some of my YouTube stuff, but I'm getting back into it. I'm going to be doing a lot more baseball card openings. I'm going to do some more wrestling memories. I'm going to have more special guests. Carl, I want to have you on again, buddy, and I'm definitely going to have Jimmy on again because he's really a good source of these memories. Once again, this has been Summertime Wrestling Memories with your buddy Mike Messier, Jimmy Faluca. Jimmy's pretty active in the Facebook groups. We're both, I believe, in Wrestling Fans, which is our buddy Shane McKenna. He's from Chicago, close to Carl out there. I run the Foreign Object Pro Wrestling group, if you happen to be watching in the Foreign Object. Of course, this is One Pro Wrestling and sports fan, your buddy Mike Messier. If you happen to be seeing me and you say, well, gee whiz, Mike, I'm not really a wrestling fan. Well, I do have two other channels, one Mike Messier and one Man in a Camera Films. I'm going to check my phone here and see if maybe my buddy Jimmy is coming back in. Let's see here. Let's see if Jimmy's coming or if he's done. Let's see. Let's see here. I'm going to try to get Jimmy on just so we can wrap up. And okay, I think Jimmy has said his final goodbyes. It's all good. I'm going to wrap this up for us. This has been Mike and Jimmy, Pro Wrestling Memories, and Mike Messier. Mike Messier. Sorry, folks. I'm just can't do two things at once. But look, this summer is going to be another great summer for wrestling. I'm going to be going to 3 NXT shows. I believe two in July and one in August. So if you are watching this channel, if you got this far along with me, on the shorts section of this channel, you'll see clips. I go to the NXT shows. I take still photos. They don't let you take videos, but I put the clips into nice stuff, man, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So for Jimmy Faluca and myself, Mike Messier, I want to thank everybody for watching, and we'll see you next time. But keep watching wrestling, and if you have any comments or any questions, just leave them in the comments. We'll pick them up next time. Thanks, everybody.